Hi, it's great to be here. It's always a bit tough to follow Tim, of course, but anyway. Yeah, it's a really interesting area, and it's been a fascinating few years. It's become a long way since, I think, 2010 in the use of both behavioural science, which you've got a glimpse into, and also, very importantly, the use of experimentation. So I'm going to focus particularly on the green area, as you might imagine, and talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing, in fact, including on smart meters. So the BIT, the Behavioural Insight Team, this is kind of a gratuitous pretend meeting outside number 10 to remind you where we work. But that was brought into being to try and understand, well, quite often policies don't work in the way that you intend them to, because human beings are complicated and so on. So what happens if we introduce a more realistic model of human behaviour into policy making and practice? Will we get better results, as well as experimentation? And the answer has been pretty emphatically, yes, absolutely. So it ranges from all kinds of areas, from getting people to pay their tax on time. I'm sure you guys all always pay your tax on time, so you'd never receive one of these letters, but it turns out, using social norms, for example, and saying most people pay their tax on time, and you're one of the few who've yet to do so, leads to a 15% increase in the number of people who pay their tax getting that letter. Much nicer than threatening people, I think. Just say, actually, your fellow citizens are more virtuous than you thought they were. Or many people have experienced the changes in defaults around pensions. We just had the budget. You can imagine it's quite a topical area. Why is it so consequential? Well, we thought maybe people didn't want to save. Anglo-Saxons use big tax subsidies, financial incentives. It turns out they're not very effective, actually. In fact, we have quite a precise estimate from Raj Jetty, actually, who was just mentioned, that actually those tax subsidies aren't especially effective. On the other hand, changing the default, so people have the choice, but now it's just, well, if you don't want to be in the workplace pension, you just opt out rather than opt in. More than 5 million people since 2012 additional have been saving for their pensions, particularly low-income groups and the young. It's absolutely enormously impactful in terms of increasing savings. So it gives you a glimpse into our world, and we'll show you some more as we go along. I do want to say one thing, though. I do think in relation to saving the planet, nudges alone in the narrow sense aren't going to do it. I mean, it's not that incentives don't matter. We're going to have to get carbon price right. I'm sure that we will need to do stuff on those other areas as well. So I don't want to minimize the kind of importance of other variables and levers. But what nudges and these relatively small sort of seeming changes can be so important is they can be extremely cheap. You may not realize how a very small difference in the way in which you give feedback or wording can be very consequential. Actually, the organ donation one's a nice example. We did it on the DVLA site. If you were doing your car tax, and at the end it would have said, thank you, why don't you join the organ donor register? So sure enough, we just tried actually 8 different variations, and we saw the difference. Actually, social norms in general did lift it, just to be clear. In fact, by about 25%, just saying, thousands of people join the register every day. Although it turned out adding a picture alongside that of some, happy, healthy people made it even less effective than doing nothing at all, right? The picture sort of undermined the efficacy, and we didn't know that for sure until we saw it. Whereas reciprocity led to about a 35% increase in the number of people who then clicked through, right? Tiny differences, incredibly consequential. Or another one, if you've got kids to think about, how do you give feedback when your kid does something good or not? Wonderful work by someone called Carol Dweck, who showed that if when you give feedback, you say, oh, that's really good, you're a really smart kid. Actually, that was shown to make your kid less effective over time when they're given a subsequent maths test, as opposed to saying, hey, there's your mark, that was a really good effort, right? Made you more likely the kid to perform better 2 weeks later on their maths test, basically, after having struggles in between. So even these tiny wordings where you give feedback to your own kids can have quite significant consequences. All right. Well, what else? Well, one early target, actually a priority for the PM in 2010, one of the green targets, was to reduce energy use by government departments. And it was a 10% target. Actually, we did it. We did it by 3.8, 3.6%, anyway. And we did a number of things. Now, one of them was just to actually give them kind of feedback about how they were doing. And feedback is clearly a key part of how smart meters operate. I'll just show you the results, and they were quite significant. These are the scale of reductions, which had gone the other way, but you can see that, some departments particularly made massive effects. Now, sometimes they did it just by, selling a building, or actually they would just set the thermostat. So a lot of government buildings got very cold that winter, it turned out. But you can see overall the effect was quite powerful. One simple part of it was we got perm secs. We required them that when you went into the kind of headquarters of the Department of Health or whatever, there'd be a screen, and instead of the normal stuff, it would actually have in real times the performance relative ratings. Now, our permsec's might not care that much about saving the planet, but it really annoys them that another department is doing better than they are. And so having that kind of graph there was a significant driver, basically making them reduce emissions. And that carries on today. Here's an example you might want to say, was, well, how could you make it more salient? And what are the reference points? And this is one key result which is relevant to smart meters going forward. So many people will know the O-Power result, which is give you feedback about how much consumption you've got relative to your neighbours. Turns out it matters not just to do it relative to the average, it's really important to see it relative to the most efficient, because you want to watch out for these backfire effects, right? So if you see that, actually, I'm not too bad at all, actually, I'm fairly efficient. We see in some of, when the comparison was to the average, that people would sometimes increase their consumption. And we know there's a big issue in energy. So you insulate your home, great, now I'll really crank up the thermostat, right? So the reference point's really important. It's true for permsecs and it's true for all of us. Another area where we've been involved, you mentioned the politics. It's been a very high-profile political area in recent years about energy bills. And we had lots of discussions about what can we do to increase switching, which continue to this day with the recent CMA report. Well, one key difference that's now come into force, many of you will know, is that we've put a little addition onto bills, which is a QR code to summarise, your information. Why is that important? Why is that so significant? It's because, I'll come back to it in a minute, if I was going to give you one message in this whole session today, it's make it easy. If you want someone to do something, make it easy, right? Be obsessively concerned about how easy can you make it. So in this case, if you try and switch your energy bills, and even those in the sector will realise that it's often quite difficult, and you have to get the right number, and you're on the phone, and so on, as opposed to if there's a QR code which summarises your data, so you can just put your phone against it, and with the help of a switching site, it will just say, oh, David, actually, these are the best 5 tariffs for you. Would you like to switch? Oh, yeah, click here, right? That's a game changer because it takes out friction, right? So we're right to be obsessed about frictional costs. For those who doubt it, I'll just give you one more example in the style of Tim Hartford, actually, which one of my, I think, powerful to illustrate how important it is to make it easy, or frictional factors, which is around suicide rates. So for those who don't know this example, the suicide rate started dropping in the UK in the late 1950s. And first of all, people thought it was an anomaly. They fell 7 years in a row for both men and women, till they'd fallen by about 25%. Really huge difference. Those in the energy sector will probably know the reason why this occurred, which was the discovery, weirdly, of North Sea oil. So why does this change the suicide rate in Britain? It's because one of the primary ways in which people used to kill themselves was put their head in an oven, right? Remember that? It doesn't really work anymore. And the reason why it doesn't work anymore is because natural gas doesn't have much carbon monoxide in it, whereas gas used to come from coal, that's good information for those in the energy sector, which had a lot of carbon monoxide. So suddenly putting your head in the oven wouldn't work anymore. Yet you see a 25% reduction in the suicide rate, which never goes back again. So I guess I'm telling you, if adding a little bit of extra friction or not changes whether you're going to kill yourself, I assure you it'll affect whether you get a smart meter or whether you turn your thermostat up or down, right? It's an incredibly important aspect of human behaviour, or whether you switch supplier. So controls, are they important? Yeah, one of the actually hypotheses that Richard Thaler, who we work with quite a lot, had is what we should really do is that controls are a bit like video recorders for those who remember them. You get your kids to set them up, or now it's your PC or whatever it will be. So he said we should just get an army of teenagers to go out there and explain to people how to use their energy controls. Well, not having an army of teenagers, we thought, well, the next best is let's use heating engineers. So it's kind of nice, simple trial. The idea is when the engineer turns up, they'll just take a few moments to explain to you how your thermostat works and the controls would work, right? It's a nice idea. Does it work? Well, I'll show you what it does, actually. It actually did almost nothing. So it turned out giving people extra information or a leaflet or having the engineer say something didn't make a difference at all, right? Why do I show you this? Partly to illustrate the point that Tim's made, is that why you want to experiment sometimes is that some things don't work which seem intuitively plausible. On the other hand, if we turn to smart meters, they've got great advantages, right, in terms of make it easy and intuitive. You don't have to rely on the fact that someone else is going to explain it in the way that you think. Do I think we could school a teaching engineer to get someone to use their thermostat better? Yeah, I'm sure we could. You're going to do things like, explain how it works, then I'm going to get you to tell me back how it works. That will probably be very effective. But that doesn't mean they'll do it in the field. They've got other things to do. Whereas a smart meter, you can design it in that way. We are doing some trials at the moment, and the results are really promising. They are sort of threefold plus what you see in terms of O-power type trials and the effect sizes using smart meters in terms of reducing electricity. I hope we get those results out, and gas, quite soon. Right, there are at least a couple of issues you're going to want to think about in relation to smart meters. One is actually just getting people to install. Well, how are you going to solve that rather big problem? Right, that itself is quite a big behavioural problem. Am I going to be in when I say I'm going to be in? Am I going to say yes when I'm given the offer? There are loads of choices and options you're going to have about how to do that. We can learn some of that from other areas of behavioural science. So getting people to do vaccination, for example. When you give them a cue and you get the letter, is to get them to write down or think about what day am I going to do this, specifically when, where, how am I going to be in, to think that through in slightly more detail. Even a prompt on the letter means people are much, much more likely to follow through in terms of vaccination or turning up to vote or get into work more rapidly. And the same is likely to be true for smart meters. So there'll be a whole host of issues around that. But smart meters, too, clearly offer all kinds of possibilities of what else you might be able to do. We sometimes use this very simple mnemonic in terms of behavioral principles, EAST, if you want to affect behavior. Make it easy, attractive, social, timely. And you've heard some of those examples as we went along. So smart meters do the most important thing is they make it easy, right? They make it simple for someone to do it, right? They'll do a lot of the work. When you're not thinking about it, they'll be turning off your heat when you don't need it. So they're likely to be extremely effective because we've got other things to do in our lives apart from thinking about what our thermostat's doing. They can be attractive. You saw that in the video. They can gamify. They can be playful. One of the most powerful things to do, for example, is not just to think in terms of money, but think about some other metric which people respond to, like the red and the green on those displays. Really powerful. And one of the most powerful bits of behavioral science out there is air miles. I don't know how many of you do these things for air miles, but people do extraordinary things for air miles to get that silver or the gold. People literally book extra flights which they don't use in order to make sure they get to the next category. If you monetize and work out what the air mile is worth, it is absolutely insane. But in fact, precisely because it's not monetized, it's more powerful in terms of its behavioral effect. And you can see how you can do that in the design of a meter. Social, what's everybody else doing? We've seen social can be incredibly powerful, the reference to other people. Be careful what that referent is, by the way, as you've seen already. And timely, when's the moment? When's effective to do the cue? Not least around installation. So particularly look out for moments when the behavior is disruptive for some other reason. So when someone's moving house, right, or they're having building work done, that is a key time in which you're likely to be able to affect biggest behavioral change. We know that for a number of areas. So we're doing work actually in lots of areas, which I won't go through them all. But obviously the CMA investigation, we're very interested in that. We think there's a lot of issues, particularly in relation to intermediaries and how we can make the market work more effectively. And one of the interesting questions, I think, for those in the sector is how do you compete on more than price? What are the other things you can do around quality, right, or trustworthiness that are also important to people? Winter fuel payments, we have things for a number of years about 12 million people receive a letter. It's a pretty good moment. Is there anything else you might want to say to them when they're receiving this letter about and thinking about fuel and cost of money? Timely moment to say, oh, actually, have you thought about getting your smart meter installed? Click here to have it done, or whatever it will be. The design around in-home displays and how we encourage them or not. I mean, if you're in a Victorian house, do you want this thing to look modern, or does it have to look something differently? And then all the detail. I mean, I won't go through all of it, but the key lesson, I think, remains, and I would absolutely echo, I think, Tim's point, which is that smart meters aren't just important because they will lead to these significant improvements, but you don't have to get it perfectly on day one. They're going to open this possibility to revise and reform and adapt, not only for a smart grid, but to find the most effective ways that work for people, not only in general, but potentially around segmentation too. So what will work for some people? So I'll just give you a kind of concluding example. One of our famous examples I touched at the beginning was around these letters. When you get your letter and you've been late paying your tax and it says, Sasha, most people pay their tax on time and you're one of the few who've yet to do so. Obviously, you wouldn't have received that letter. It turns out it works for 95% of the population, right? So it was a great result, and everyone was very proud of it. Hundreds of millions generated through this kind of trial. It turned out actually there was 5% of the population for whom it didn't work, and actually it backfired. It worked worse. They were less likely. Unfortunately, they were the people with the biggest tax debts. And when they received this letter, they became less likely to pay than they otherwise would have been. It's like, oh my God. But of course, that isn't the end of the game. We can then figure out, well, what message works for them. It turns out it's a very nice message. It's really important that you pay your taxes, because without them, we can't pay for schools and hospitals. Actually, in 95% of the population, that makes very little difference. But for the top 5%, particularly the top 1% of tax debtors, when they would receive this letter, they became very much more likely to pay their tax. In fact, the difference between the two messages is roughly a doubling in the proportion you would then pay in the next 30-odd days. So smart meters open the world not only as a one-shot deal, but the ability to refine and segment and improve our behavior in lots of ways, and beautifully, generally in a way which is easy and without us having to be effortful for what we do. So it's a pretty exciting area, and who knows, maybe you'll save the planet. Oh, I should have said, by the way, if you're interested, you can also read about our stuff, as you can read about Tim's stuff, if you want to get more detail on the organ donation and other trials. Thank you very much.